Thank you to Rec Watchers for sponsoring this video. In the late 1950s, the CIA began flying U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union, trying to figure out what kind of missiles they were building, which, according to Nikita Khrushchev, they were churning out like sausages. For 4 years, these high-altitude flights gave America critical intelligence, but everyone knew these flights wouldn't last forever. President Eisenhower was worried about the international embarrassment and political fallout should a U-2 be downed by a Soviet missile and displayed in Moscow for all the world to see. The message was clear. America needed something that could fly faster, higher, and beyond anything the Soviets could touch. Fortunately for America and the free world, Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, had been thinking ahead. Kelly had already started sketching his next creation. The goal for this new machine was ambitious: to build an aircraft that could cruise at Mach 3 and beyond, fly above 90,000 feet, survive temperatures that would melt lead, and take crystal clear photos, all the while remaining invisible to enemy radar. Building it, however, was another question. It proved so difficult and so challenging, it was like they were building the first aircraft all over again. Engineers faced problems that no one had ever solved. How to work with titanium, which could shatter like glass if dropped, or lubricants that turned solid at room temperature. Had to invent fuels that didn't boil away at high altitudes, design engines that had to run for hours on full afterburner, build an airframe that could withstand the constant heating and stretching, and to top it off, to remain invisible to enemy radar. But solving the machine wasn't enough. The pilots had to survive in a cockpit that could reach 400 degrees at Mach 3, and a sudden decompression at 90,000 feet meant instant death. And the cameras? The cameras that had to take crystal clear photos through glass that was heated up to 550 degrees while flying 3 times the speed of sound, nearly 17 miles up in the stratosphere. Those cameras had to work flawlessly or the entire program was pointless. Each of these challenges alone could have ended the program, but instead, against all the odds, Lockheed built the sublime A-12, the first of the Blackbirds. So as always, pop the kettle on, break open a fresh box of cookies, because we're diving into the insanely fascinating development history of the A-12, the father of the SR-71 Blackbird, and how these incredible machines came to be. But before we light the afterburners on this story, today's video is brought to you by Rec Watchers and their Habu series of timepieces. This isn't just a Blackbird inspired watch, it contains actual titanium from the aircraft itself. The Habu is a limited edition watch with a lower dial forged from the SR-71's inner engine nacelle exhaust ejectors, the so-called turkey feathers that regulated the afterburner at Mach 3 and temperatures of 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit, a detail we'll cover in the engine development chapter. These components came from the SR-71B number 617956, the most flown Blackbird in history with over 1,400 sorties and nearly 4,000 flight hours, a true Cold War legend. This aircraft served at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, earning the nickname Habu after the local pit viper. That name now lives on in this edition, limited to 1,372 pieces. Every detail mirrors the jet itself: the lightweight titanium case, cockpit-inspired gauges, hands shaped like the Blackbird silhouette, a crown modelled after the engine inlets, and a Kevlar inlaid strap with the red no-step stripes. Even the power reserve at the 6 o'clock position nods to the Blackbird's tri-ethyl borane engine ignition system, which we cover in the fuel development chapter. It's a mechanical tribute to one of aviation's most outstanding achievements, as you'll discover in the story, and you can find it exclusively at recwatchers.com. Naturally, you can help support the channel and my tea and biscuits habit by scanning the QR code on the screen or using the code JOE at the checkout for 10% off your purchase. So, thank you to Rec Watchers for sponsoring this video. Most definitely one of the most enjoyable projects I've put together. Now let's kick the tires, light those J78s and dive into the development history of the A-12, the father of the Blackbirds. Why it was built, how it was built, and the incredible innovations that made it unstoppable. To really understand how the Blackbird came about, we need to take a step back and look at the state of affairs in the mid-1950s. Back then, the U-2 spy plane was America's eyes over Soviet skies, perched at 70,000 feet, peering deep into Soviet territory, keeping a watchful eye on the Red Menace. The U-2's creation was a direct response to an increasingly tense post-war world in which the United States had to confront the rise of the Soviet Union as a nuclear power. President Harry Truman and his advisors recognized that American survival in this new era depended on timely and accurate intelligence, not only to monitor troop movements or foreign policy shifts, but to anticipate existential threats in the form of nuclear weapons. In the early days of the Cold War, no intelligence questions carried more immediate and profound implications than understanding the size, sophistication, and intentions of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. A surprise attack, a so-called nuclear Pearl Harbor, was a scenario the US government couldn't afford to ignore, and the CIA's first decade would be dominated by efforts to mitigate precisely that danger. However, human intelligence proved to be insufficient for the task. The Soviet Union's espionage countermeasures were formidable. Tight security, sophisticated internal surveillance, and a culture of secrecy made traditional spycraft both dangerous and unreliable. Agents could gather only fragmentary or anecdotal information, and in some cases, the intelligence proved outright misleading. The CIA quickly recognized that to truly penetrate the Iron Curtain, the United States would need technological eyes in the sky. Aircraft and eventually satellites capable of overflying Russia, her allies in the Warsaw Pact, and Communist China, capturing data that human spies couldn't. Despite its delicate appearance, the U-2 was a remarkable achievement. It could fly well over 70,000 feet, believed to be beyond the reach of Soviet fighters and missiles of the time, and it carried sophisticated cameras capable of capturing detailed images of strategic sites. Operational secrecy was essential, although they were operated by the Central Intelligence Agency under the classified cryptonym of Aquatone, later redesignated Chalice. A cover story was cooked up. If there were any questions, the U-2 was a high-altitude weather research aircraft operated by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and the pilot was a civilian. However, initial projections suggested that under favorable conditions, the U-2 could conduct overflights of Soviet territory for 2 years before its design limitations and potential Soviet countermeasures would compromise its effectiveness. But until then, they would make hay. From its very first mission on July 4, 1956, the U-2 hazardous overflights of denied territory, the results were immediate and significant. The aircraft became the most important source of intelligence on Soviet strategic forces, photographing missile sites, bomber bases, and nuclear facilities. Yet their early optimism would prove misplaced, as the high-flying U-2s were detected by Soviet radar operators from their very first flight, even if they couldn't be easily intercepted. In fact, Soviet radar had tracked the first 2 flights as they proceeded from West Germany through Eastern Europe and over the USSR on July 4th and 5th, 1956. Immediately, the Soviet leadership protested these overflights, which forced Eisenhower to suspend them. Flying over Soviet territory, in fact flying over anyone else's territory without permission, broke international law, and a shootdown would spark a diplomatic nightmare. Worse still, CIA intelligence showed that Soviet radars were becoming increasingly more sophisticated. Their long-range VHF radars operated around 100 to 170 MHz, like the P-30, the P-35, and the P-14 Tall King, could spot a U-2 hundreds of miles out. Deeper in, high-frequency S and X-band radars painted clearer tracks for targeting their high-flying bird. Also, the exceptional SA-2 missiles were coming online. Now the U-2, America's best tool for spying on the Soviet Union, was living on borrowed time, and President Eisenhower knew it. But the intelligence they had gathered was simply too good to pass up, and they wanted back in over the USSR. The CIA's first fix to this problem was called Project Rainbow. Kicking off in 1957, this was an ambitious project to make the U-2 invisible to Soviet radars. Richard Bissell, who had led the spy plane programs into the early 1960s, pushed Lockheed's legendary designer Clarence Kelly Johnson to try some form of electronic camouflage. The initial solutions were clever but rough. One of the first attempts was called Trapeze, which used wire structures hung around the fuselage to scatter radar waves. These wires were trailing dipoles designed to absorb signals, reducing the U-2's radar return by approximately 12 decibels, which in practical terms meant that long-range detection was halved. However, the star of the show was an idea they called wallpaper, which was a radar-absorbing coating based on a World War II concept known as a Salisbury screen. This wallpaper started with a thin plastic laminate bonded to the U-2's nose, tail and underside of the fuselage, which all acted as reflective surfaces. On top of this, there was a honeycomb spacer, followed by a conductive layer, tuned to absorb and reduce returns in the low-frequency bands of signals from Soviet early warning radars, such as the P-30 and P-35. All of this was then coated with a protective layer to add durability, and finally, a layer of paint blended it in with the airframe. But it was a disaster. Johnson, who designed the U-2 to be lean and light, thought bolting on extras was a bad idea, and he was right. Wallpaper added weight and drag, costing a Rainbow U-2 about 5,000 feet of altitude and 20% of its range. For an aircraft that wasn't designed to outrun Soviet interceptors and missiles, that was a deal breaker. Worse still, wallpaper only worked against low-frequency VHF radars. Higher frequency S and X-band systems used for missile guidance saw right through it, bouncing off fuel tanks, wing spars, even rivets. Onboard recorders confirmed the bad news. Soviet radars could easily track the U-2. Johnson and his Lockheed team at the infamous Skunk Works had another brilliant idea. Could an all-plastic airframe dodge radar? So they built several fiberglass models, including a larger prototype which they tested at Indian Springs near Groom Lake. You know, the place where they store the aliens and the flying saucers. However, the results were simply awful. Thick fiberglass needed for strength reflected radar almost as severely as metal. The fuel in the wing tanks created standing waves, making the plane look like a solid block on radar. Corners, joints, metal parts made it worse. Ultimately, the plastic U-2 was scrapped. Then came a tragedy. In April 1957, test pilot Robert Seeker was flying a Rainbow-equipped U-2 on a test flight. The wallpaper blocked the engine cooling vents, causing it to overheat and flame out. This meant that the aircraft lost cabin pressure. Due to an issue with his helmet seal, Seeker lost consciousness, after which the U-2 entered a flat spin, falling out of the sky. As the aircraft descended to a lower altitude, Seeker came to and managed to eject, but he hit the tail on the way out. He didn't survive. It was a brutal and costly lesson. Rainbow fixes weren't just ineffective, they were deadly. Then, on October 4th, 1957, the world changed. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, and with it a wave of fear rolled across the United States. To the average American, it seemed as if the Soviets had leapt far ahead simply overnight. If they could put a beeping sphere into orbit, what else could they launch? Missiles, nuclear warheads, straight into American cities. President Eisenhower tried to calm the nation, insisting the launch wasn't unexpected. In fact, they told the public that, in reality, US intelligence had been more than aware that the Soviets were preparing for a satellite launch and there was nothing to be concerned about. But the public wasn't buying these reassurances, especially when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's bluster filled the headlines. He was bragging that they were producing intercontinental ballistic missiles like sausages. A bold exaggeration that played perfectly into the American anxieties about a so-called missile gap. Critics in Washington seized the moment. Rising political stars like Senator John F. Kennedy hammered Eisenhower's administration for complacency, budget cuts and mismanagement. Their message was clear. The USSR appeared to hold the upper hand. But Rainbow wasn't a total failure. It had uncovered something significant, a critical insight in designing the U-2 successor. Search radars, like the ones you've probably seen at airports, sweep the sky with a rotating beam. When the beam strikes an object, it produces a flashing blip on the radar screen. For a slow-moving plane, the blips from successive sweeps appear in roughly the same spot, allowing the operator to track it. The length of time the aircraft stays within the radar beam is called the dwell time. The slower the plane, the longer it remains in the beam, and the easier it is to form a continuous track. But if an aircraft flies fast enough and high enough, its dwell time drops to just milliseconds. The blips would appear briefly and then vanish, often lost in the background noise, especially if the operator isn't paying close attention. This fleeting return is the essence of the blip scan effect. The question was asked, how fast and how high would an aircraft have to fly to reduce its dwell time to the point of being just background noise? And to nail this question down, the CIA teamed up with MIT's Lincoln Lab and the Scientific Engineering Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts for the blip scan study in late 1957 to determine what kind of aircraft would be needed to be so fast as to be invisible to radar. The conclusion? The new aircraft would need to hit Mach 3, fly above 90,000 feet, and have a radar cross-section under 10 square meters, ideally 5 or less. The studies performed under Rainbow also pushed forward stealth technology. MIT's Frank Rogers discovered coatings that could be used to dampen multiple radar frequencies, and Ed Lovett came up with dielectric wedges that, when set within a wing's leading edge, could scatter radar signals. We'll come back to these a bit later on. Lockheed even built its first anechoic chamber to measure the cross-section of an aircraft, and in the event that you missed this class in school and are wondering, an anechoic chamber is a standard and often necessary space built for measuring radar cross-sections, as its foam-lined walls absorb electromagnetic waves and their reflections, so that only the direct path between the source antenna, target and receiving antenna is measured. Well, at least that's the simplified explanation. Anyway, although these ideas didn't help the U-2, they did set the stage for something bigger. Rainbow proved that you couldn't patch stealth onto an existing aircraft. It had to be baked in from the very start, with every angle and material designed to hide it from radar. But without Rainbow's failures and its breakthroughs, there'd be no A-12, no SR-71, and no stealth era that followed. Running concurrently with Project Rainbow's efforts to reduce the U-2's detectability, the Air Force was already pursuing a radically new reconnaissance aircraft to evade Soviet defenses through speed and altitude alone. Started in early 1956, Project Suntan aimed to develop a Mach 2.5 aircraft powered by liquid hydrogen, funded by the Air Force and led by Lockheed Skunk Works under Kelly Johnson. Though the program didn't produce a flying prototype, or at least none that I could find, its technical insights combined with Rainbow's failure to make the U-2 stealthy were critical in laying the groundwork for the AE-12 and the SR-71. The centerpiece for Project Suntan was the CL-400, a massive aircraft design measuring nearly 300 feet in length with a gross takeoff weight of 358,500 pounds. Its size was dictated by the need to carry 163,000 pounds of liquid hydrogen, a low-density fuel far less dense than jet fuel. However, this fuel required voluminous tanks to achieve a target range of 2,500 miles, essentially making it the world's largest flying hydrogen tank. The CL-400 was intended to cruise above 99,000 feet at Mach 2.5, putting it beyond the reach of any contemporary Soviet interceptor or missile. Johnson believed that this could be the aeroplane to rule the skies for a decade, and the Air Force agreed and funded the program, allocated $95 million, which enabled Lockheed to order 2.5 miles of aluminium extrusion for the airframe, and Air Products to construct a hydrogen liquefaction plant in Florida, and MIT to develop the inertial guidance system. This was one of the US Air Force's most secret projects, for which only 25 individuals were cleared for the program. Liquid hydrogen was chosen for its high energy per unit mass, and while it offered superior performance over conventional fuels, handling it nevertheless posed some very serious technical challenges. At the time, 31-year-old Ben Rich, then a Skunk Works thermodynamicist, was given the unenviable responsibility by Kelly Johnson to oversee small-scale production in a fortified facility in Burbank. As an aside, when Ben Rich was tasked with assessing the feasibility of liquid hydrogen, he travelled incognito around the United States, visiting research facilities under the Skunk Works alias Ben Dover, to gather critical insights on its safe handling and production. In time, they were producing up to 200 gallons of liquid hydrogen daily that had to be stored at cryogenic temperatures and needed an elaborate infrastructure of insulated tanks and pipelines with very strict safety measures such as wearing grounded footwear, using non-sparking tools, and the liberal use of hydrogen leak detectors to mitigate the risk of an explosion, although on one occasion they did almost blow themselves up when a hydrogen leak filled one of the hangars. At this point, I must recommend Ben Rich's book, where he describes the adventures of producing liquid hydrogen. You'll find the title of the book in the description. It's well worth a read. Engine development proved equally difficult. Initially, Lockheed attempted to use Garrett's exotic Rex-free hydrogen engine. However, they couldn't meet the technical or performance demands, so Pratt & Whitney was brought in to develop the Model 304 hydrogen engine, which was first fired up on test stands in 1957. But even then, the engineers could see the limits. The best they could squeeze out of the engines was a marginal 5 to 6% improvement in fuel efficiency over conventional fuels. And the range was barely 2,500 miles, even after cramming in as much liquid hydrogen into the fuselage. Not to mention the logistical nightmare of supplying cryogenic hydrogen stored at minus 253 Celsius or minus 423 Fahrenheit to operational bases worldwide, and this was deemed unsurmountable, and Kelly Johnson, ever the pragmatist, recognized the trap and concluded by early 1957 that the CL-400 was fundamentally flawed, privately describing it as a dog. For a man famous for delivering on impossible promises, it was a bitter admission when he walked into the Pentagon and told the Air Force the unvarnished truth. Suntan wouldn't work, telling them, "I'm afraid I'm building you a dog. My recommendation is that we cancel Suntan and send you back your money as soon as possible. We don't have the range to justify this project." It was a stunning moment of candor. He recommended killing the project outright and instead pursuing a smaller, lighter airframe powered by two new Pratt & Whitney J58 engines running on specialized hydrocarbon fuel. The Air Force accepted his recommendation and Project Suntan was formally cancelled, and in an almost unheard gesture of honesty, Skunk Works returned nearly $90 million of the $95 million allocated back to the Air Force. Here was Johnson, a man with millions of Air Force dollars already invested, a plant under construction, engines on test stands, and miles of raw material in his hangar, telling his customer to cut their losses, and they listened. Unfortunately, Suntan left behind no prototype and no iconic photographs, but it left behind crucial lessons. The program advanced the understanding of high-speed aerodynamics, thermal management, and large-scale cryogenic fuel handling. Pratt & Whitney's 2.5 years experience with liquid hydrogen made possible the development of the RL-10 rocket engine, which was installed in a variety of missiles and eventually used to launch scores of satellites. In the end, Project Suntan was both a humiliation and a triumph. Proof that even Kelly Johnson could misjudge the future, but also proof of his unmatched pragmatism. He refused to let pride or sunk costs blind him to reality. By killing Suntan, he saved the resources and the momentum that would soon deliver the fastest, highest flying aircraft the world had ever known. The hydrogen dream had died, but out of its ashes, the Blackbird would be born. I want to take a second here to thank you so much for watching. I'm truly grateful to share my love of aviation with fellow enthusiasts like you. So if you're enjoying this story, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference in helping me reach more aviation fans. Now, let's get back to the story. Now, this is where the road to the A12 and SR-71 really starts getting traction. I think that's the right expression. Anyway, so this is where we get into the meat of the story, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were many moments when Lockheed were almost out of the running, and to all intents, they should have been, only to be rescued from the brink at the very last minute on multiple occasions. So let's begin. Around 2 years after the first flight of the U-2 and just after Project Suntan had been cancelled, Johnson was already sketching his first Mark III design, which he called the U-3, that would be powered around either the J-58 or J-93 engines. You can see that the U-3 very much resembled the F-104 with its trapezoidal wings, but with twin vertical stabilizers canted outward, engine nacelles that merged into the fuselage, and also, like the F-104, movable horizontal stabilizers. So even after Suntan's demise, he didn't want to waste any time, as it was clear to him that the U-2 would eventually be vulnerable to interception, and this was a full 2 years before a Soviet SA-2 missile shot down Gary Powers. Ben Rich, who would one day take over as president of the Skunk Works, recalls Kelly's announcement of the new aircraft. "We'll fly at 90,000 feet, jack up the speed to Mach 3, it'll have a range of 4,000 miles, Kelly told a group of us. The higher and faster we fly, the harder it'll be to spot us, much less stop us. Kelly Johnson's goal was ambitious. He proposed an aircraft that wouldn't just edge past the U-2's record, but would fly 5 miles higher and cruise at nearly 4 times as fast, putting extreme speed and altitude performance at the heart of the aircraft's survivability rather than stealth. At Mark III, this new machine would outpace the best jet fighters of the day by more than half again, eclipsing even their short-lived bursts of speed. Rocket-powered test planes such as the Bell X-2 had reached Mark III, one of them in 1956, but it remained there only for a few seconds before running out of fuel. Unfortunately, this test flight ended in tragedy when the aircraft tumbled out of the sky and ended in a fatal crash. Johnson's vision was for something altogether different, a machine that could sustain that pace, cruise faster than a rifle bullet, and cross the continent in under an hour on a single load of fuel. This machine was, to all intents and purposes, going to be the equivalent of returning to the drawing board, starting from scratch and building the first aircraft just like the Wright brothers. Had this idea come from anyone else, they'd have been laughed out of the room, but coming from Kelly, the boss of the Skunk Works, who'd, after all, built in 1954 the F-104 Starfighter that was capable of Mark II, then a Mark III aeroplane seemed like a logical extension of his skills and talent. Kelly Johnson understood that incremental improvements wouldn't suffice. In his words, "It makes no sense to just take 1 or 2 steps ahead, because we'd only be buying a couple of years before the Russians would be able to catch up. I want us to come up with an aeroplane that can rule the skies for a decade or more." But the leap from vision to a real-world operational machine was daunting. Even though Lockheed had already produced the F-104 Starfighter, which could light its afterburners for takeoff or for brief supersonic dashes, there is a world of difference between that and creating an aircraft whose normal cruise speed was nearly twice as fast as a fighter's top dash speed. You see, in conventional jets, afterburners drank fuel at 4 times the normal rate and were reserved for combat emergencies, escaping flak, outrunning missiles, or closing in on MiGs or getting away from them, whatever may be the case. What Johnson was proposing was unprecedented. His would be an aircraft that would fly the entire mission in afterburner. However, a project of this magnitude would require the backing of the president, and to men like Kelly Johnson, who fought and moved quickly, President Eisenhower often seemed overly cautious, to the point that he was referred to in private as Speedy Gonzales. Weeks or even months could pass before the White House gave its approval for a U-2 mission over the Soviet Union, and for consideration of a new reconnaissance aircraft project might take years. Yet Eisenhower's caution was deliberate. He valued the intelligence the U-2 provided, but he never lost sight of the political risks. A shoot-down would set off an international crisis, and thus the president weighed each mission against that possibility. Satellites offered a tempting alternative. Eisenhower saw them as less provocative, a means of collecting intelligence without directly violating national airspace. However, satellite photography in those days was still in its infancy, and it would be years before the kinds of images returned by the U-2 could be matched by spaceborne eyes. And unlike an aircraft, satellites followed predictable orbits, giving the Soviets plenty of warning to roll their missiles under cover. In fact, it wasn't until the early 1960s, with the success of the Corona program, that the US began to receive its first truly usable high-resolution satellite imagery. On the other hand, a spy plane remained flexible. It could fly missions anytime they needed, then loiter over areas for hours on end and deliver imagery of far higher quality than any satellite then in existence. Nations would just have to learn to live with the spy satellites, since there was very little, if anything, they could do. However, a spy aircraft flying over their territory was seen as an aggressive violation of a country's sovereignty. Of course, these concerns were also shared by the CIA, which knew that to maintain a decisive intelligence advantage, the United States would need an aircraft that could fly much faster and higher, much higher than the U-2, beyond the reach of even the most advanced Soviet defenses, and of course, more stealthier, to the point of invisibility. However, before the concept of a super Mark III high-altitude spy plane reached President Eisenhower, Richard Bissell, the CIA man, sought outside guidance. He turned to the nation's top scientific and technological advisors to form an independent committee to review and compare competing aircraft designs. The Land Committee, named after the chairman Edwin Land, founder of Polaroid, was created, and this was made up of some of the best academic, industrial and technical minds in the country, bringing together engineers from aircraft manufacturers who sat alongside senior Navy and Air Force officers, and they would, over the next year, put the competing manufacturers through the mill. Although often called the godfather of the U-2, Richard Bissell was determined not to simply award the follow-on contract to Lockheed, but then he may have also thought a competition might do Kelly Johnson and his team some good, and from a CIA perspective, maybe to apply some leverage on Johnson. The committee's role was to debate the proposals, weigh trade-offs, and help define what the next generation of high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft should be. This was the start of Project Gusto, a competition to design the U-2 successors, which would ultimately lead to the A-12 and finally the SR-71 Habu. Some of the entries were, to say the least, a little bizarre, as you would expect. One Navy concept, which together with Goodyear proposed an unusual craft under the name Project Champion. This was to be a high-flying spy aircraft with inflatable wings that could be lifted high into the stratosphere by a balloon. Then, at 100,000 feet, the pilot would inflate the wings, release the balloon, light the booster rockets to start a ramjet, and then roar up to 155,000 feet and on its way to his mission. A Navy commander presented this unique idea to the panel while Kelly sat scribbling figures on a pad. By my calculations, Kelly told the group, in order to lift that ramjet, the Navy's balloon would have to be over a mile in diameter. Gentlemen, that's one hell of a lot of hot air. Nevertheless, Kelly was asked to investigate the feasibility of the Navy's Heath Robinson affair, and after some calculations and studies, the idea was dismissed as impractical. Bissell also invited Convair to present their ideas for a reconnaissance aircraft. Convair at the time was developing the beautiful Mark II B-58 Hustler bomber. A link to that video is in the description. Now, funny story, when I was researching and writing this episode, I really wanted Convair's entry to win. Silly really, but I do love the B-58 and it would have been interesting to see how their entry, if it had won, would have performed. By the way, did I mention the link to my Hustler video is in the description? Now, Convair was seen as the natural choice to go up against Lockheed since they were already working on the supersonic bomber, and if anyone knew anything about going fast, it would be the brilliant Robert Widmer and his team at Convair. Very quickly, Widmer proposed the first invisible Super Hustler, or simply FISH, which was a single-seat ramjet-powered Mark IV Parasite aircraft intended to be carried beneath a modified B-58 bomber, which we will revisit later. The early design process was both intensive and highly experimental. Lockheed went through multiple concepts, initially labelled Archangels, a carryover from the original moniker Angel given to the U-2 during its development, but this was later simplified to boring sequential designations such as A1, A2, all the way to A12. Lockheed's first attempt, designated Archangel 1, was a sleek single-seat bullet-shaped delta-winged aircraft with a pair of engines in nacelles adjacent to the fuselage, which was proposed to be made of titanium alloy. Johnson set a gross weight of 100,000 pounds with a wing area of 1,950 square feet and a 60-foot wingspan. The design aimed for a mission radius of around 2,000 nautical miles with a cruise altitude starting at 83,000 feet and gradually climbing to 88 and 93,000 feet as fuel was consumed. However, wind tunnel testing identified issues with turbulence around the wing and fuselage, which could disrupt airflow into the engine inlets during pitch and roll maneuvers. Johnson briefly considered adding ramjets to the wingtips to increase altitude, but without enlarging the wings. However, this added weight and increased fuel consumption, which of course reduced range. Although Archangel 1 was potentially capable of Mark III using a relatively conventional layout and engines, it had several drawbacks, the most significant being that the design didn't address radar detectability. The next attempt, Archangel 2, was Johnson's effort to revise Archangel 1 to get a 4,000 mile range while flying 10,000 feet higher, hoping to regain the altitude lost when they dropped hydrogen for hydrocarbon fuel after the demise of Project Suntan. Archangel 2 was an interesting combination of turbojets and wingtip ramjets that was expected to cruise at Mach 3.2 and above 100,000 feet with a 4,000 mile range. So on paper, the design met the range and speed requirements. However, it also came with significant problems. The aircraft was very large, with a takeoff weight of approximately 135,000 pounds, and the ramjets required pentaborane fuel, which was highly toxic and difficult to handle. In fact, the burnt fuel was so poisonous that even the vegetation died in a 2,000-foot long swathe behind the engine test stands. Most importantly, the exposed corners, circular inlets and prominent engine nacelles did nothing to reduce the radar cross-section and would have been relatively easy for the Soviets to detect. And this radar visibility for the president was his overriding primary concern. Performance was all very well and good, but what he wanted was to ensure that the Russians never knew the aircraft was overhead in the first place. So when Kelly presented Archangel 2 to the Land Committee, questions of using toxic pentaborane for the ramjets arose, along with the high projected development costs and the biggest one of all, the almost complete lack of attention to reducing the radar cross-section. Johnson was sent away with a flea in his ear and reminded that the president required a reconnaissance aircraft that was invisible to radar. Kelly's next attempt would be focused on reducing the aircraft's RCS, and to achieve this, the smaller Archangel 3 would still retain a pair of wingtip-mounted ramjets powered by the same borane fuel, alongside a pair of JT-12A engines mounted on top of the wings. This design would also eliminate horizontal stabilizers, thereby removing another potential source of corners that could reflect radar. This was despite the very large vertical stabilizer providing a nice big reflective surface for any radar. On October 30th, 1958, the final A3 design was completed, measuring 62.3 feet in length with a wingspan of 33.8 feet and an empty weight of only 12,000 pounds. Despite the relatively modest thrust from its two turbojet engines together with its twin ramjet power plants, the aircraft was capable, on paper of course, of cruising at Mach 3.2 at 95,000 feet with an estimated range of 4,000 nautical miles. However, when they conducted the radar cross-section tests on scale models, they found that the returns averaged out to be the same as those of the U-2, mainly due to those ramjets. But it was too late to modify the design, as by November 1958, Lockheed had to present its design alongside Convair's Fish. The Land Committee once more reviewed both designs, and after some days, Kelly's A3 was edged out by Convair's Parasite concept due to their machine having a lower radar cross-section. As such, Convair was given the green light to proceed with design development. For now, it seemed like Lockheed's proposal was dead in the water, but there was hope. Kelly was later told on the quiet that his A3, being a single aircraft rather than an air-launched parasite aircraft, was infinitely better than the fish. But all was not lost. The committee agreed to reconsider Lockheed's design, but only if he could this time work to reduce the radar cross-section of their machine and not just focus on speed and altitude. So, starting at the end of November and continuing over the next 2 months, work began on a new set of concepts designated A4, A5 and A6, where engineers continued to work on additional configurations, experimenting with various combinations of speed, altitude and range, with the primary focus this time being on reducing the radar cross-section. By early January 1959, the A6 studies were well underway. This variant underwent at least 9 different iterations, and it's here that we start to see the first hints of what would become the A12 begin to appear. All of the A6 designs had a single afterburning J58 turbojet in the fuselage, supplemented by 2 ramjets. The most significant advance in this design was the introduction of the fuselage chine configuration. Beginning near the nose, the chines blended smoothly into the fuselage and continued into the leading edges of the wings. The layout also had twin vertical stabilizers that were canted inward and partially masked by the wings, with rudders whose trailing edges were swept forward rather than extended aft beyond the wing's trailing edge. This was done to hide them from radar, another technique that the A12 eventually adopted. One interesting attempt to save weight during climb and cruise was to jettison the main landing gear after takeoff, leaving only a small lightweight gear for landing. Once extended, this smaller gear provided only 5 inches of ground clearance. While the A6 was projected to cruise at Mach 3.2 at 90,000 feet, its range was limited to only 1,300 nautical miles, well below operational requirements. It became clear that achieving maximum speed, altitude, range and a minimal radar cross-section simultaneously wasn't possible in a single design. Ramjet propulsion was also judged too underdeveloped to support long-range cruising. So the smaller A6 concepts ultimately proved to be a dead end. However, the exercise had compelled Lockheed's team to delve into radar signature reduction in much greater depth, resulting in a deeper understanding of both the methods involved and their impact on overall performance. The drawback was that none of the designs they had come up with satisfied all of the operational requirements. To the engineers, the dilemma was apparent: how could one possibly hide something that blazed across the sky like a meteor? Next, attention shifted to another group of layouts labelled A7 through to A9. Not much can be said about them, other than the A7 resembled the F-104 with ramjets on the wingtips rather than tip tanks. But while Lockheed was desperately trying to get at least one design right, Convair was having its own set of problems. Firstly, the CIA had a job on their hands to clear enough personnel to work on the fish, and there were also concerns about physical security. Although Convair had already undertaken classified work for the Air Force, Project Gusto was on another level and had to be kept away and out of sight from uncleared staff at all costs. Bissell also had the nagging feeling that having a parasite aircraft would significantly increase the chances of something going wrong. Another issue that arose was that wind tunnel testing had shown that the drag of the fish slung under the B-58 would double that of the B-58 alone. This meant that although the B-58 could accelerate from subsonic to Mach 2 in about 3 minutes, with the fish strapped to the underside of the aircraft, it will take almost 9 minutes. Secondly, the fish design had to be stretched to improve stability and balance, but also to create additional room for fuel. Wind tunnel tests revealed another complication. At low speeds, the center of pressure on the mother ship was farther forward than had been expected. And to counter this, the center of gravity also needed to shift forward, a change that could only be achieved by lengthening the B-58 mothership by about 5 feet. This requirement effectively ruled out the standard B-58A model, which lacked the power and structural capacity for the job. Instead, the concept would depend on the proposed B-58B variant that would be fitted with the more powerful J-79-9 engines, a longer fuselage, strengthened wings and landing gear, and a larger tail, all necessary to carry and launch the parasite fish. The problem was that the B-58B existed only on paper and was at the time unfunded. Or in other words, without a suitable host, the fish would be dead in the water. Meanwhile, over at Lockheed, after the series of dead-end small aircraft designs, they shifted focus back to building larger, faster aircraft, in the words of St. Jeremy of Clarkson, more speed and more power. Out of this came two new proposals, the A-10 and the A-11. The A-10 was essentially a refined version of Archangel 1. It was 16,000 pounds lighter, faster and capable of cruising at Mach 3.2 above 90,000 feet. On paper, it ticked the right boxes. If you recall, Archangel 1 made no concessions to reduce the radar cross-section. It was built to go high and fast. To address this, Lockheed made some half-hearted attempts to add radar-absorbent material around the side of the underwing engine nacelles and fuselage. And although these attempts would have lowered the RCS, it would have increased drag, but in all likelihood, they would have achieved very little. But the J-93 engines, which had been selected when Archangel 1 was first started and were being developed for the B-70 bomber, were falling behind schedule. In fact, they were almost 2 years behind the Pratt & Whitney J-58 units. And without the J-93s, this meant that Lockheed would likely have to fall back on the J-58s, which, if the performance figures were to be believed, were more promising, even though it was still unproven and would mean, of course, a new design. If the A-10 was a refinement over the many previous attempts, then the A-11 was an escalation and was far more ambitious than any of the earlier Archangel proposals. The A-11 was larger and heavier and designed to operate directly from US bases and fly missions over 13,000 miles long with multiple aerial refuelings, thereby avoiding the security and diplomatic headaches of relying on foreign airfields. The A-11 would carry a dual-fuel system carrying 17,000 pounds of JP-150 and 31,000 pounds of high-energy fuel, or HEF, which is a borane-based jet fuel from the 1950s designed to give aircraft more range. Lockheed wanted the two J-58 engines to burn the HEF at high cruise altitude and speed and the JP-150 at lower and slower flight regimes. Early sketches even toyed with having canards to improve pitch stability and new interesting inlet designs. But one thing it wasn't stealthy. However, it was seen as practical and above all, it looked achievable. Considering the A-11 was only one iteration from the final A-12, the image shows Lockheed still had a long way to go. It was now June 1959 and the A-11 would now go head-to-head against Convair's Fish. Both designs could do the job, both could reach Soviet targets. However, Lockheed's A-11 was cheaper, simpler to maintain, and far easier to operate securely. Nevertheless, this didn't mean that Lockheed would be given a blank check. There were still issues with the RCS. The Fish, on the other hand, depended on the new B-58B bomber as its launch vehicle, and that was its fatal weakness. The end for the Fish came when Convair attempted to sell the upgraded B-58B to the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the time, General Curtis LeMay. During the briefing, Convair explained the benefits of the B-58B, such as side-by-side seating and many other advantages. And with LeMay being a veteran of World War II flying bombers over Europe, he saw this aircraft as a good concept. LeMay sat through the briefing, nodding here and there, and then finally asked a simple question: when can I have it? The reply was disastrous. Convair, wanting to recover the costs of building the original B-58A, said they would need SAC to buy 3 more wings of the Hustler before they could even start on the B-58B variant. LeMay didn't argue, he didn't debate, he just stood up and walked out the room and left his deputy to deliver the verdict. Convair was told by LeMay's staff that they would never again do business with Strategic Air Command. And with that, the B-58B and along with it the Fish were finished. However, SAC were not the only game in town, and Convair would return with a new design to compete against Lockheed for the CIA contract. Yet Lockheed's A-11 also failed to clear the bar. As sleek as it was still far too visible, its radar cross-section was still too large, and so this is where the story pivots. Johnson was convinced at this point that Lockheed was out of the running. None of his designs were good enough to meet the demanding requirements. But to his surprise, just a month after the last committee meeting, he was instructed to get back to work, but this time to really work and focus on that RCS. And so, both firms returned to the drawing board and the contest continued. By August 1959, both companies were ready with their refined designs once again. This time Convair returned with their Kingfish, a single-seat ground-launched reconnaissance aircraft with a relatively small radar signature powered by two Pratt & Whitney J58 engines. Lockheed countered with what became its definitive entry. The changes weren't just cosmetic, they were fundamental, with several stealth features, some more obvious than others. The most apparent change from the A-11 was the addition of the chines, which had first been tried on the A-4 to solve the problem of radar corners. On the A-11 design studies, sharp right angles where the wings joined the fuselages or nacelles created strong radar reflections, presenting an obvious target to ground-based radar. To address this, the A-12 introduced the chines, streamlined cobra-like fairings that ran from nose to tail, blending the wings smoothly into the fuselage. And it was this look that earned the Blackbird its moniker, the Habu, after the venomous pit vipers found on some islands of Japan. This eliminated the hard corner reflections and reduced radar returns by as much as 90%, scattering much of the energy away from the receiver. It was a direct application of the radar cross-section reduction principles first explored in Project Rainbow. The chines, however, were far more than just a stealth feature. They contributed roughly 20% of the aircraft's total lift, acting as fixed canards. This additional lift reduced trim drag and helped control the large center of pressure shifts that occur at supersonic speeds. The strong vortices generated by the chines also improved directional stability, especially at subsonic speeds and around a 6-degree angle of attack where the A-12's delta wings were less effective. This aerodynamic benefit allowed Kelly-Johnson to dispense with the canards and complex trimming devices that had been proposed in earlier Gusto designs, simplifying the configuration considerably. The chines did, however, introduce new challenges. The lift they produced could cause pitch-up tendencies and side-slip at cruise angles of attack, which left unaddressed would create handling difficulties. To manage this, the A-12 relied on a triple redundant stability augmentation system, or SAS, to maintain control and damp out unwanted oscillations. But beyond stealth and aerodynamics, the chines provided valuable internal volume. They housed wiring, plumbing and avionics, and in later variants were adapted for additional functions, missile bays for the YF-12A and sensor equipment for the SR-71. In combining radar reduction, aerodynamic stability and system integration, the chines became one of the Blackbird's most distinctive and successful design innovation. Some of Lockheed's choices even went against the strict guidelines established by the Gusto radar study teams. For example, by blending the wings and nacelles into a single continuous shape, they created concave surfaces that, in theory, could reflect radar when viewed directly from below. Even the underside of the fuselage was reshaped into a broad, convex curve. To the eye, it almost resembled the profile of a flying saucer, but this wasn't about looks. That curve was engineered to scatter radar energy in unpredictable directions, making it far more challenging for operators to get a consistent track. Lockheed had judged, and correctly so, that radars would almost never be looking straight up at 90,000 feet. It was a calculated compromise, except small theoretical risks in exchange for massive gains in practical survivability. Next came the twin composite all-moving vertical tails. On the A-11, the tail was almost conventional. On the A-12, the twin tails were canted inwards at 15 degrees. This subtle change had significant effects, as any radar energy coming from the side wouldn't bounce straight back to the emitter. Aerodynamically, the tilt lined up the fins with the vortices streaming off the chines, reducing drag. Even the side force created by the rudder deflection passed closer to the center of gravity, which meant less rolling moment and less corrective input from the ailerons. The result: better stability, lower drag, and a smaller radar signature. The engine inlets were reworked entirely. Whereas the A11 had rectangular inlets, the A12 was given the now famous circular inlets with movable spikes. At low speeds, the spikes sat forward, and as the aircraft accelerated, they would begin to slide backwards, creating a series of shockwaves that slowed the air before it hit the compressor face. Not only did these spikes control the airflow and protect the engines, they also shielded one of the biggest radar reflectors on any jet, the compressor blades. The inlets themselves were treated with a radar-absorbent material, further reducing the return. More on these spikes later on. While Lockheed was perfecting this new shape, Convair was pushing Kingfish as its answer. It looked futuristic, it promised stealth, but it came with huge risks. By July, the CIA's analysts were split. Some believed even the A-12 would still be tracked, while others argued its radar return could be made small enough to confuse Soviet operators. But in a bigger picture, the choice was becoming clear. The fish was gone with the cancellation of the B-58B variant, the A-11 was too visible to radar, Kingfish was too exotic, expensive and risky, and that left only the A-12. On July 20th, Bissell briefed President Eisenhower, presenting the A-12 as the logical successor to the U-2, Mark 3.2 and later 3.5, with an expected radar cross-section just 1/20th that of the B-47. Yes, it could still be detected, but at those speeds and altitudes, tracking it continuously would be almost impossible. A month later, on the 28th of August 1959, a further careful evaluation by representatives from the CIA, the Air Force, and the Department of Defense, Kelly Johnson got the word. Lockheed had won. Convair was out. And the A-12 was in. And it was given the codename Oxcart, a name selected from a list of deliberately deceptive identifications, although some say it was just a random name chosen out of a hat, which is quite amusing considering that an Oxcart is a slow-moving vehicle. Funding for an initial 4-month phase totaled $4.5 million, stipulating that Lockheed had to demonstrate by July 1, 1960 that it could reduce the aircraft's RCS sufficiently, along with conducting aerodynamic testing and engineering validation. During this initial phase, with a full-scale mock-up in wind tunnel experiments, the A-12 gradually took on its distinctive shape, which, viewed head-on, resembles a snake swallowing 3 mice. However, these adjustments meant that the A-12 had to shed structural weight while increasing fuel capacity to reach its target altitude of 91,000 feet, leaving no margin for error. Kelly Johnson noted in his project log, "We have no performance margins left. So this project, instead of being 10 times as hard as anything we have ever done, is 12 times as hard. This matches the design number and is obviously right." Difficult or not, by January 1960, the CIA was convinced enough to formally authorize full-scale construction of the A-12, marking the transition from Project Gusto conceptual phase to the Oxcart program. Lockheed's initial cost estimate for the A-12 program came in at $96.6 million, a figure that, while ambitious, seemed manageable when the project began, but as the design refinements started to pile up and new technical hurdles emerged, it quickly became clear that the program's price tag would soar well beyond that figure. Anticipating such risks, the CIA had inserted a clause requiring periodic reviews of costs. That clause was invoked repeatedly over the next 5 years as expenses rose sharply with each engineering breakthrough and, of course, setback. Yet, despite the spiraling costs, there was little debate in Washington about whether to continue. The alternatives had already failed or fallen short. The once reliable U-2 was now too vulnerable and no longer possible after the public embarrassment of Francis Gary Powers' shootdown on the 1st of May 1960. The promising but unproven Corona satellite program couldn't yet deliver consistent or detailed imagery, and no other aircraft or space vehicle then in development could meet the urgent demands of the US intelligence leaders. In that tense moments of the Cold War, when American survival seemed to depend on knowing precisely what the Soviet Union was building, the A-12 represented not merely another aircraft but a lifeline. Therefore, US leaders were willing to pay handsomely, and soaring costs were thus accepted as an unavoidable price of survival. What followed was a period of extraordinary innovation and extraordinary difficulty, as Lockheed Skunk Works attempted to turn radical design ideas into a working machine. Johnson wrote in his biography, "The idea of attaining and staying at Mach 3.2 over long flights was the toughest job the Skunk Works ever had and the most difficult of my career. Early in the development stage, I promised $50 to anyone who could find anything easy to do. I may as well have offered $1,000 because I still have the money." So it seems that winning the competition was only the start of what would become one of the most challenging projects ever undertaken. The fact that the project had progressed this far demonstrates the confidence the government had in its American engineering abilities. Lockheed's Burbank facility, where the U-2 had been built, was the natural first choice for the A-12 program, but it quickly became obvious that Burbank wouldn't work. The runways were too short for a heavy high-speed aircraft, and the plant sat right in the middle of a busy metropolitan area, far too exposed for a project that demanded absolute secrecy. Thousands of civilians lived nearby, and the press watched every move that Lockheed made. And for an aircraft program that was meant to remain invisible, Burbank was the worst possible place. The CIA and Air Force drew up a checklist of what the new site would need. It would have to be remote from cities and civilian flight paths, but close enough to Air Force infrastructure for support, with at least an 8,000-foot runway and large-scale fuel storage with reliable weather. No single Air Force base met all the requirements. Edwards, for example, had the runways, but not the security. The solution came in the Nevada desert, inside the Nevada test range already controlled by the Atomic Energy Commission. The site lacked infrastructure, but its isolation and natural secrecy more than offset every shortcoming. Construction began in September 1960, and Lockheed workers were flown in from Burbank to Las Vegas and then ferried out to the desert. At first they lived in trailers under harsh conditions, but surplus Navy housing and modest amenities slowly transformed the barren outpost into a functioning community. By 1960, a new runway had been poured long enough to handle the A-12's weight. Fuel facilities lagged a little bit behind, so for the first few months, convoys of trucks had to haul in 500,000 gallons of specialized jet fuel needed every month. By the time the first A-12 arrived in August 1961, the essential infrastructure was already in place. Over the following years, the remote base grew into a secret city. By the mid-1960s, more than 1,800 people lived and worked there, supplied by daily shuttle flights from Burbank to Las Vegas. For those who spent years there, the place gained a mythic reputation. As one CIA officer observed, the A-12 practically spawned its own industrial base. One of the first of the great challenges was figuring out how to handle the heat. Even before they had started building the first A-12, wind tunnel tests had shown that flying at Mach 3 would cause the intense friction heating on the fuselage to actually stretch the entire airframe by a couple of inches. At Mach 3, air friction generated skin temperatures that ranged from 500 to 1000 Fahrenheit. Engine inlets reached 800 Fahrenheit, turbine inlets exceeded 2000, and afterburners combusted at 3,500 Fahrenheit. Conventional aluminium, the workhorse of aviation, couldn't withstand such blowtorch temperatures. Steel, although able to survive the heat, was far too heavy, and Lockheed had limited experience building complex honeycomb structures from it. The solution lay in titanium alloys, which are strong, lightweight, and capable of surviving the A-12's punishing environment. And if you want the specific flavors of titanium alloys, I've put them up on the screen. Here you go. These metal alloys were almost as strong as stainless steel but weighed half as much, the ideal balance of strength to weight ratio and heat resistance, and titanium's tensile strength would allow Lockheed to make the wings and fuselage paper thin. Certain sections of the aircraft, like engine nacelles, the exhaust systems, required nickel alloys, such as Rene 41, Hastel Alloy X and Wasp Alloy, which were capable of surviving temperatures exceeding 3,500 Fahrenheit. Other exotic materials included Lock Alloy, which was made from 62% beryllium and 38% aluminium, and high-temperature composite for radomes and cockpit panels were also tested to meet the aircraft's stealth and thermal requirements. Then there was the question of the internal components, such as the plumbing, which had to be gold-plated since gold retained conductivity at extreme temperatures better than copper or silver, although over time they realized that the gold plating wasn't required, so they just left it to wear out and it wasn't used generally. The challenges went far beyond materials. There were no available parachutes, drag chutes, or ejection systems that could survive the heat loads of the aircraft would encounter. No suitable fuels, oils, or lubricants existed. They had to consider ways to avoid camera lens distortions from airframe heating, and pilot life support equipment capable of operating in such an environment, well, they simply didn't exist. Lockheed had to solve all of it in-house, right down to producing its own titanium screws and fasteners. Basically, they had to reinvent the wheel. Unfortunately, all of these exotic metals, materials, and components were causing the cost to skyrocket faster than the eventual A-12. But selecting materials was only the beginning. Interestingly, titanium isn't even a scarce element, being the 9th most common element in the Earth's crust at a weight of 0.6%. In fact, there is more titanium in the Earth's crust than carbon, an element that's not even considered rare. But the thing is, titanium is notoriously difficult to machine and therefore very expensive to get right. During one of the early morning design meetings, Ben Rich proposed using a softer titanium alloy, a mix of titanium with vanadium, chromium, and aluminium, which would give it extra strength and resistance to oxygen damage at high temperatures. Both chromium and aluminium form firmly stable oxide layers on the outer skin of the metal. This prevents oxygen from diffusing further into the metal and causing it to become more brittle. Vanadium acts as a stabilizer, which results in a material with a higher tensile strength and improved formability. There you go, a little lesson in metallurgy. With this alloy, the aircraft could now survive skin temperatures of up to 800 Fahrenheit for hours at a time. While it sacrificed strength at lower temperatures, Ben Rich argued the trade-off could be managed through surface treatment. He pointed out a fundamental principle of thermodynamics. A material that absorbs heat well also radiates it efficiently. By painting the aircraft black, its emissivity would increase. Try saying that after 3 pints. Emissivity, allowing the wings to radiate away more heat than they absorbed from aerodynamic friction and solar heating. Rich calculated the effect would lower skin temperatures by about 35 degrees Fahrenheit, an elegant and straightforward solution. According to Ben Rich, Kelly Johnson initially opposed the idea. He was obsessed with shaving every possible pound from the aircraft, and adding hundreds of pounds of paint seemed counterproductive. But after a night's mulling over the idea, Johnson reconsidered. The trade-off made sense. The modest weight penalty was worth it if it allowed the use of softer, more workable titanium alloys, while the black paint itself helped manage the extreme heating problem. By morning, Johnson had agreed, and the A-12's distinctive black finish was set. And Ben Rich even won a quarter from Johnson, a rare win apparently. There was one slight issue. Lockheed's supplier, Titanium Metals Corporation, couldn't provide enough of the material, so the company turned to their friends in the CIA for help. Through a web of dummy corporations and third-party cutouts, the agency quietly secured shipments from the world's largest exporter of titanium, the Soviet Union itself. Unwittingly, the Russians became suppliers of the very metal that would form the backbone of an aircraft designed to spy on their own territory. Soon, however, Lockheed quickly discovered that titanium behaved very differently from aluminium. Where a drill bit could cut hundreds of holes in aluminium before needing resharpening, titanium dulled bits after only a dozen holes. The main issue is that titanium's extremely low thermal conductivity causes heat to build up during machining. This concentrated heat can damage the cutting tool and affect the titanium itself, leading to hardening. As a result, the freshly cut metal becomes harder, which further increases tool wear. Coolant is typically used to reduce heat, but because titanium conducts heat so poorly, very little of it is transferred to the coolant. Over time, Lockheed developed specialized tools and lubricants that extended tool life. Eventually, they could manage hundreds of holes drilled before the bits wore out. As Lockheed began to work on full-scale mock-ups of the fuselage and cockpit section, more than 6,000 individual parts, they quickly ran into another nightmare with titanium. Early batches were so brittle that when a piece lifted off a workbench, it shattered like glass. The problem was traced to poor heat treatment and inadequate quality control at the supplier. However, to prevent oxidation of the titanium, which, as we know from my earlier lesson in titanium alloys, causes brittleness, they had to build special chambers filled with inert nitrogen gas in which to perform the welding. Lockheed instituted its own rigorous inspection system, and for a company famous for avoiding bureaucracy, the Skunk Works suddenly found itself buried in red tape to ensure the metal was usable. Every single lot was sampled for brittleness. Quality control became almost ritualistic. For every 10 parts produced, 3 test samples were cut, heat treated, bent or stress tested to destruction to ensure the reliability of the remaining batch. Traceability was meticulous. Each of the over 13 million titanium parts produced for Skunk Works aircraft, records were kept. This allowed each part to be traced back to its mill batch, mill pour, and even I've read, I'm not sure if this is true, but I've read this, even the rolling direction of the sheet. But titanium also proved to be chemically treacherous. It reacted aggressively with elements commonly found in the aircraft factory. A simple mark from a Pentel pen, which used chlorine-based ink, could etch a groove straight into the metal. There was even an issue with the simple spanners and wrenches that the mechanics used to tighten bolts with. These cadmium-plated wrenches were leaving trace amounts of cadmium on the bolts. Although using cadmium-plated tools was acceptable when everything was cold, the cadmium would cause galvanic corrosion once heated during flight. This problem was discovered only when bolt heads started to shear off entirely. Naturally, all the cadmium-plated tools were quickly removed from the toolboxes. Even the local water supply became an unexpected hazard. Spot welds on panels began to fail within 6 to 7 weeks, and after some intensive detective work, it was discovered that the panels had been welded during July and August when the Burbank water system was heavily chlorinated to prevent algae growth. After this, they were forced to wash the panels in distilled water. Heat testing revealed further surprises, with some of the earliest engineering trials resulting in spectacular failures. The first wing section warped in a hotbox that was used to simulate flight temperatures, folding in like an old dish rag, and when subjected to the thermal loads expected at Mark III, the wing panels warped into shapes resembling potato chips, or crisps. It was clear that the conventional smooth panels wouldn't survive the constant expansion and contraction at high-speed operations, and after months of trial and error, the solution was corrugated titanium skin applied to the wing surfaces. These cord-wide corrugations running from the leading edge to the trailing edge allowed the panels to expand under heat and contract as they cooled without distorting the wing's aerodynamic profile. In practice, the corrugations would deepen slightly by only a few thousandths of an inch during high-temperature cruise and then return to their original shape upon descent. Although unconventional in appearance, the approach proved highly effective, and Kelly Johnson himself joked that the wing resembled a Mark III Ford trimotor, the corrugated aluminum fuselage of an early Ford airliner. Aluminium airliner, not aluminum. Each problem solved revealed 2 more waiting behind it, but slowly Lockheed learned how to work with a material that had never been used on this scale before. Despite the obstacles, the results were extraordinary. Though titanium made up about 85% of the A-12 structure, the remaining 15% was built from early generation non-metallic composites. These weren't chosen to save weight but to reduce the aircraft's radar cross-section. They had to survive skin temperatures of 500 to 1000 degrees Celsius on leading edges and other exposed surfaces while absorbing radar energy instead of reflecting it back to enemy receivers. For this, the skunkwork engineers went back to the Project Suntan's parts bin to fish out composite materials they had developed like silicon asbestos, phenolsilane and fiberglass laminates that could now be used on secondary structures that include the chines, the wing leading edges, the inlet spikes and the vertical stabilizers. Though not primary load-bearing components, they more than endured their heavy aerodynamic and thermal stresses while absorbing or scattering radar signals. The A-12's wing geometry was especially interesting. Instead of smooth surfaces, the leading and trailing edges were serrated into a sawtooth pattern that you can see here in the video. Triangular pipe panels of radar-absorbent composites were interlocked with titanium alloy panels, scattering incoming radar waves in multiple directions while the composites absorbed the energy. The same method was applied to the elevons as you can see here in the video. These greatly lowered the radar cross-section and improved on the blip scan studies during Project Rainbow. Alternative methods were also tested. One, called softening, proposed filling wing notches with graded dielectric wedges to absorb radar energy gradually, but its complexity outweighed the benefits. Lockheed also invested pyroceram, a graphite-impregnated ceramic capable of withstanding high temperatures, though it was ultimately abandoned. The A-12's serrated panels represented one of the first large-scale applications of radar-absorbent materials on an operational aircraft. These reduced the aircraft's radar cross-section to roughly 1 to 2 square meters, well below Project Gusto's 5 to 10 square meter goal, a remarkable feat for the 1960s, and these innovations laid the groundwork for future stealth aircraft such as the F-117 and the B-2. You wouldn't think that the landing gear system would also have to face extraordinary challenges. However, like the radar-absorbent composites, the landing gear needed new materials and engineering to survive the high temperatures exceeding 400 Fahrenheit, while retracted during high-speed cruise and still supporting an aircraft with a maximum takeoff weight of 62 tons. Lockheed, using the lessons and expertise that it had gained during Project Suntan, where engineers like Ben Rich had faced similar thermal challenges, worked with Goodrich to develop a specialized rubber compound infused with aluminium particles, giving the nitrogen-filled tires a distinctive silver hue. These particles were infused to help with radiant cooling, dissipating the heat to prevent explosions within the confined gear well, which was also shielded by insulated buckets. The A-12's tricycle landing gear was operated by hydraulic systems and was equally robust. The nose gear had 2 wheels which retracted forward, while the main gear, each bogie having 3 wheels per side, folded inward from the wings towards the fuselage into a 3-foot 3-inch wide compartment separating the inboard wing sections. Takeoff and landing posed additional hurdles due to the A-12's massive weight and the suction effect of the J-58 engines, which could pull debris from the runway. Crews meticulously swept and vacuumed the runway before every flight to prevent damage from foreign objects. Upon landing, a wheel braking system and a drag chute stored in a compartment atop the aft fuselage provided critical deceleration, particularly during aborted takeoffs. What is impressive is that throughout the entire life of the A-12, the YF-12A and the SR-71, Lockheed managed to produce a landing gear with 0 in-service failures. But no matter how advanced its titanium airframe, no matter how powerful its engines, the Blackbird couldn't have existed without the fuel that powered it through the thin air at Mach 3.2. That fuel was a substance as remarkable as the aircraft itself. I know you're probably thinking, it's just fuel, how interesting could it be? Well, top up your tea, this chapter was one of the most interesting parts for me to research. From the start, the challenge was clear. Conventional fuels, JP4, JP5, even the specialized blends used in the U-2 couldn't withstand the A-12's extreme environment. At Mach 3.2, the aircraft's integral tanks would heat to 350 Fahrenheit, engine inlets would exceed 800, and afterburners would ignite a gas-air mix at around 3,500 Fahrenheit. Existing fuels would either boil off or explode. Kelly-Johnson and his engineers tested exotic alternatives, liquid hydrogen, coal slurries, boron compounds, but each hit a wall. Hydrogen required a flying vacuum bottle insulated to near absolute zero, with logistics demanding a fleet of C-124s to support a few aircraft. So, like Project Suntan, that was out of the question. Coal and boron slurries clogged turbines and injectors that would destroy engines as quickly as they powered them. The solution came from Jimmy Doolittle, a Shell oil executive who'd previously helped Lockheed with the U-2's LF-1A fuel. As an interesting side note, Shell had curtailed production of its insecticide Flit during the U-2 program to supply LF-1A chemicals, causing a nationwide shortage of insecticide. Collaborating with Shell, Ashland, Monsanto and Pratt & Whitney, his team developed LF-2A designated JP-7 by the Air Force. Unlike standard aviation kerosene, JP-7 was engineered to endure temperatures from -90 Fahrenheit during high altitude refueling to +650 Fahrenheit in sustained supersonic flight. It also contained cesium additives that reduced the radar signature of the exhaust plume. However, this stability created a new problem. How do you ignite a fuel that refused to ignite? Its low vapor pressure and high flash point made it so stable that a lit match could extinguish it rather than ignite it. This was something that Johnson relished demonstrating to visitors. Although electronic igniters would be able to light the JP-7 since it had an extremely low vapor pressure, it would ignite at 165 degrees. You see, the trouble was that the electronic igniters would fail when they became extremely hot at Mach 3, since, as we know, that electronics and heat do not mix well. Enter triethylborane, or simply TEB, also known as zip fuel, is a pyrophoric liquid so volatile that it ignites instantly upon exposure to air and burns at 3000 degrees Fahrenheit and is not, and I repeat, an active ingredient in Red Bull. The TEB was stored in sealed 1.25 pint tanks, just over half a litre, under gaseous nitrogen to prevent explosions. You can see the TEB tank here sitting on top of the J-58. TEB was so dangerous that filling its tank required non-essential personnel to clear the hangar while two heavily suited technicians handled the fluid cart. The engine start itself was theatre. The ground crews rolled up with start carts that contained a pair of Buick, later Chevy, V8 engines, each capable of 450 horsepower. These would, via an extension to the J-58 massive engine starter shafts, spool the jets to life. And when the engines reached 3000 RPM, the ground crew would alert the pilot, who would move the throttles from the cutoff to the idle position. Moving the throttles to idle caused a precise metered shot of TEB to be injected into one of the burner cans, igniting the fuel. The burner cans were designed with crossover connections, allowing the flame to propagate around all the cans. And it was this squirt of TEB that was responsible for the green flames seen shooting out of the back of the engine at startup. When the throttles were moved to the afterburner position, was injected into the engine to fire up the afterburner. Each of the small zip fuel tanks contained approximately 16 shots of TEB, with a remaining TEB counter mounted on the throttle quadrant that tracked the number of remaining squirts. And before anybody asks what happens if the pilot runs out of TEB during a mission, the J-58s had a series of backup platinum-based catalytic igniters to fire up the afterburners. JP-7 also doubled as a thermal management system, with cold fuel flowing through heat exchangers to cool the pilot's cabin, avionics and wheel wells, preventing the tires from exploding under the radiant heat of supersonic speeds or the pilot from roasting in the cockpit. The A-12's titanium airframe, however, brought its own complications. At Mach 3, it expanded up to 4 inches and then contracted during subsonic refueling or landing, stressing the fuel tanks, essentially the aircraft's core structure, beyond any known sealant's capabilities. The A-12 was effectively a flying fuel tank, a wet wing design, with 6 integral fuselage tanks and wing tanks spanning from the leading edge to the aileron support beams, holding nearly 11,000 gallons or 64,800 pounds of fuel. Reinforced with titanium alloy longerons and bulkheads, these tanks were pressurized with nitrogen to prevent collapse during descent and reduce fire hazards. Despite expansion joints, as mentioned earlier, no sealant, not even 10,000 linear feet of specially developed fluorosilicone, could withstand JP-7's chemical effects and the extreme temperature and pressure swings, which softened the sealants every time the airframe cycled through the extreme heating and cooling. On the first aircraft, 68 leaks appeared when the tanks were filled, exacerbated by JP-7 acting as a reducing agent that softened the sealant during thermal cycling. Despite all the safeguards, fuel leaks persisted, with pilots learning to live with an acceptable leak rate of between 5 to 60 drops per minute. No matter what Lockheed tried, leaks were never eliminated. Fuel leaks were not the only challenge. In testing, the A-12 could only manage an unrefueled range of around 2,800 nautical miles. That was impressive for a Mark III aircraft, but still well short of the over 4,000 miles Lockheed had promised on paper. In reality, those bigger numbers were only possible in theory, under ideal cruise conditions with tanks filled to capacity. But the A-12 could never actually take off that way. The tanks leaked too badly on the ground, and the aircraft would have been dangerously overweight for the runway. That's why aerial refueling became absolutely essential. Every single mission started the same way: take off with partial fuel, level off low and slow, and immediately rendezvous with a KC-135Q tanker waiting nearby to top off the fuel before climbing to operating altitude. Refueling, however, wasn't exactly routine. The KC-135Q tanker would be flying flat out, engines straining at maximum power just to keep up its end of the rendezvous, while the A-12 had to throttle all the way back, wallowing at the very bottom of its performance envelope just to stay behind the long boom long enough to take on the fuel. It was an almost comic mismatch, one aircraft flying as fast as it could and the other as slow as it dared, yet it was the only way to give the Blackbird the range it needed. From there, the Blackbird could finally stretch its legs. Operational missions typically required 2 or even 3 in-flight refuelings, but with tanker support, the A-12 became a true globe-spanning reconnaissance platform, American eyes in the skies no matter where. Endurance flights proved that it could stay airborne for more than 7 hours, mixing subsonic loiter with long supersonic dashes. But those Mark III dashes came at a cost. The aircraft consumed fuel at a staggering rate of around 20,000 pounds per hour per engine or thereabouts. Without tankers, the A-12's reach was limited. With them, it could put almost any point on Earth under its cameras faster than any aircraft before or since. If the titanium was the bones of the aircraft and the JP-7 that powered the J-58 were the blood of the A-12, how about the lubricants? A little unglamorous maybe, but as anyone who has any experience with making sure moving parts remain moving parts, they were absolutely essential. Without the correct oils and fluids, this sleek machine would have been little more than a desert sculpture. And yet, when Kelly Johnson's skunk work engineers first set out to find lubricants and oils that could survive temperatures hotter than molten lead, they discovered that they were looking for something that simply didn't exist. Standard aviation oils that had served well in piston engines and even the early jets would break down in seconds in the superheated bowels of the J-58s. Worse still, the fluids couldn't just tolerate heat, they had to handle the extremes. The A-12 would be operating in air thinner than champagne bubbles, then slow to a subsonic crawl to refuel, its systems plunging from hundreds of degrees above zero down to -90 Fahrenheit in mere minutes. Nothing on the market could span such a wide range without freezing solid, boiling away, or tearing seals apart in the process. Kelly Johnson later recalled the futility of those first surveys of commercial suppliers. He had asked around the industry, surely someone had a fluid with the kind of heat tolerance that the A-12 demanded. One supplier came back with the proud answer, their hydraulic fluid could withstand 960 degrees Fahrenheit. Kelly ordered a sample immediately. When it arrived, the delivery man dropped off a canvas bag. Johnson was overheard saying, "That's a funny way to ship hydraulic fluid." He untied the bag and out spilled not a liquid, but a block of white crystal. The supplier hadn't lied. The stuff might well survive 960 Fahrenheit, but at room temperature it was a solid. "You'd need a blowtorch just to thaw the hydraulic system," Johnson remarked. That single moment captured the entire problem. Everything that worked at one extreme failed at the other. Hydraulic systems needed fluids that wouldn't fail due to the heat generated at Mach 3 speeds and be stable enough to flow smoothly when sat on the runway. Engine oils also needed to resist burning under heat so intense it could melt glass but not turn into glue on a cold Nevada morning. The eventual solutions required not tweaks but entirely new chemistries. Lockheed Skunk Works, working again with Shell, Ashland, Monsanto, Pratt & Whitney and chemists at Pennsylvania State University, ventured into uncharted territory, the development of high-performance synthetic lubricants. The resulting oils and fluids were as strange as the aircraft itself. The new engine oil was a pure synthetic called polyphenol ether, rated for 600 degrees Fahrenheit and tested beyond that to 650, with a viscosity comparable to that of honey stored in a freezer, thick as molasses, technicians said. At room temperature, it was almost solid, and to get the engine started, maintenance crews had to preheat the oil before every flight until it flowed enough to circulate, and it took about an hour to heat it 10 degrees. To keep the oil usable at cooler temperatures, chemists laced it with a diluting agent, ensuring that it wouldn't simply gum up at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below. The hydraulic fluid was even more delicate. After the white crystal fiasco, Lockheed worked with Penn State's research laboratories to develop a synthetic base that could withstand both extreme heat and thin, frigid air. Into their formula, they folded multiple secret ingredients, each carefully selected to balance vaporization resistance, lubrication, and pump compatibility. Sounds like I'm selling hand soap here. It became a true Frankenstein's blend, but ultimately it worked. Unlike the crystals, this fluid remained liquid, which, as you can imagine, was needed to lubricate pumps and gears and didn't vaporize into a gas at altitude. Even with these victories, the A-12 punished every assumption. Ordinary seals like rubber O-rings or leather washers cooked instantly at those temperatures. Kelly Johnson's engineers discovered that steel was the only answer, substituting metallic seals where traditional materials had failed. Pumps designed for other programs warped or seized until Johnson, with his characteristic pragmatism, borrowed from the North American XB-70 project. "Modify the damn thing and make it work," he ordered. But nothing about these fluids came easily. Mechanics complained that engine oil clung to their tools like tar, and it had to be handled almost like an unstable explosive, carefully matched with compatible materials lest it react with cleaning agents or corrode titanium parts. The paranoia over contamination apparently became legend at Burbank and Groom Lake. Even something as innocent as wiping down a part with the wrong rag could lead to corrosion. Johnson himself described the process as maddening. In January 1962, after yet another session with Pratt & Whitney engineers, he wrote in his log that their troubles with the J-58 engines were desperate and almost unbelievable. Every subsystem, fuel, air, metal, oil was conspiring against them. "It sometimes felt," he said later, "that we're doing nothing but making test samples, and that might have included the lubricants as much as the titanium. Yet gradually, through persistence, failure and stubborn invention, the fluids stabilized. The synthetic oil, which had to be heated like soup before takeoff, never failed under flight conditions. The Frankenstein hydraulic fluid blend proved itself time and again, maintaining a steady temperature of 600 degrees Fahrenheit when lesser fluids boiled away. The chemical formulas devised by Shell and Ashland and Monsanto were guarded jealously. Few outside the program ever knew that the aeroplane's survival depended on oils so exotic that they were more chemistry experiments than industrial products. One Lockheed engineer joked that if the Soviets ever discovered the recipe, they'd probably laugh and then try to steal it anyway. In the end, the lubricants and fluids were proof of a theme that ran through the entire Oxcart saga. To build the fastest jet in the world, you couldn't just invent new aeroplanes, you had to invent new everything. Perhaps the most significant challenge lay in the engines. These were naturally to be the heart of the A-12, and if they were going to outfly Soviet missiles and avoid radar detection, they needed to be unlike anything the world had ever seen. Kelly Johnson and his team had, of course, during the whole design process, looked at many engine combinations and power plant alternatives. For instance, a pair of conventional air-breathing turbojet engines were considered too weak. But what about jet and rocket engine hybrids? Well, these are thought to be too complicated. In early Archangel design studies, Lockheed engineers explored a dual-engine concept, conventional turbojets for takeoff and low-speed cruise, paired with ramjets for sustained Mach 3 flight. On paper, this hybrid approach promised to cover the full flight envelope from subsonic to extreme supersonic speeds. However, this would be in practice a complete logistical and engineering nightmare. Ramjets, which rely on high-speed airflow and only function effectively above Mach 2, were useless at lower speeds, while turbojets suffered compressor stalls and lost efficiency as airflow approached Mach 3. Carrying both systems meant increased weight, complexity and maintenance burdens compounded by the need for potentially incompatible fuels, kerosene-based JP7 for turbojets and exotic, often toxic high-energy fuels like boranes or liquid hydrogen for ramjets. Ramjets of the era were also notoriously finicky, struggling with shockwave management and thermal stresses, and offered little margin for error. So what seemed elegant in theory proved unworkable in reality. The solution was the J-58, a revolutionary unified turbojet ramjet hybrid that burnt JP7 and could push the A-12 past Mach 3. But for Kelly Johnson and his skunkworks team, the J-58s would become both a savior and a curse. They promised the power to outfly Soviet defenses, but before they could deliver, they nearly broke the program. The J-58 story began not with the CIA's Oxcart, but as the JT-11D-20s for a then-dead project. In 1956, Pratt & Whitney redesigned it as a J-58 for a supersonic interceptor that never materialized. And by 1959, when Lockheed came a knock-in, the J-58 was still the only candidate with the potential to push the A-12 into a sustained Mach 3 flight, although it required significant modifications, and any engine producing that sort of power would generate a significant amount of heat. Inside the engines, where compressor blades would reach temperatures of 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, every standard alloy would have melted. Pratt & Whitney engineers admitted not a single part down to the last split pins could be made from the same materials as previous engines. The solution was a catalogue of exotic alloys. Titanium alloys were used for the forward compressor stages, strong enough to withstand the searing heat yet light enough to prevent the blades from disintegrating at supersonic tip speeds. Nickel-based superalloys such as Inconel and Wasp alloy were used for turbine blades and vanes that could maintain their shape while glowing white hot. Astra alloy forgings for the turbine discs that cost a small fortune, each one a miracle of metallurgy that could survive temperatures where steel softened like wax. But the J-58 didn't cooperate. By late 1961, Pratt & Whitney was falling behind. The engines were overweight, underpowered and nowhere near ready. Johnson's diary from January 1962 reads like despair. He wrote, "Their troubles are desperate. Prospect of an early flight engine is dismal, and I feel our program is greatly bogged down." However, one by one, each of the problems was solved. By the time the engines were ready to fly, each J-58 pushed out 32,500 pounds of thrust, the equivalent of the combined power of the Queen Mary's turbines and the modified J-58-1 engines for the YFA and the SR-71, which were heavier airframes, pushed out even more, approximately 33,000 pounds of thrust. If you look closely at the nacelles in profile, you'll spot something interesting. Because the A-12 cruised with a slight nose-up attitude, flying at about 5 to 6 degrees angle of attack, the engine nacelles were initially mounted with their axes tilted approximately 3 degrees downward relative to the airframe in the hope that this would point them directly into the oncoming airflow. But as wind tunnel testing continued during prototype assembly, engineers discovered that the air wasn't arriving straight on. Instead, it was being deflected outward from the nose towards the sides of the aircraft. On top of that, the A-12's cruising angle of attack turned out to be higher than expected, meaning the incoming flow was also rising relative to the wings more than had been predicted. The fix was to realign the inlet so the spikes aligned with the true direction of the airflow. Both spikes were canted slightly downward and inward. Luckily, the adjustment came early enough that the prototype's nacelles didn't require major rework or scrapping. At 80,000 feet, the air that meets the A-12's inlets has a pressure of 0.4 psi, almost a vacuum, and a temperature of -45 degrees Fahrenheit, traveling at more than 2,000 miles per hour. The J-58 engines couldn't handle air at that speed, temperature or pressure. It had to be compressed to around 15 psi at 800 degrees Fahrenheit and slow to subsonic speed, approximately Mach 0.6, all within a 20-foot nacelle. The solution gave rise to one of the aircraft's most distinctive features, the movable inlet spikes designed by David Campbell of Ben Rich's thermodynamics team. I have to admit, I lost days diving into the step-by-step workings of the J-58. It turned out to be one of the most fascinating rabbit holes in this entire project. Honestly, it almost deserves its own standalone video, but for now, here's my attempt to walk you through how this engine worked, from takeoff all the way to Mach 3.2 and all the moving parts that made it possible. On the ground and at low speeds, the J-58 operated like any conventional afterburning turbojet, with the inlet spikes automatically locked fully forward to funnel maximum airflow into the 9-stage axial compressor. The compressor's primary job was to densify incoming air and provide the combustion chamber with sufficient oxygen for an efficient fuel burn and to produce the thrust. But the real engineering genius lay in the nacelle's inlet system, a sophisticated series of moving parts that included the movable spike, or center body, forward and aft bypass ports, center body bleed louvers, shock trap bleeds, and suck-in doors. Notice in the video how the nacelle surface is dotted with louvers and vents. These aren't decorative, but essential for managing airflow in and around the engine. The spike's center body also had a series of small bleed slots. You can just about see them here in the video. These pulled in boundary layer air, a thin layer of low pressure air that normally stuck to surfaces, but if it became detached from the center body, it would disturb the airflow and reduce efficiency. To prevent this, the boundary layer air was vented overboard through nacelle louvers after passing through the hollow spike and its supporting struts. Now, only smooth, clean airflow would reach the compressor. During taxi and takeoff, the inlet system made sure that the J-58's got adequate air when it was traveling at relatively sluggish speeds. The forward bypass openings, a rotating band of ports located just aft of the inlet throat, were held 100% open by an override signal from the main gear door switch whenever the landing gear was down. This exhausted excess air through the nacelle louvers, preventing the engine from choking on too much airflow at low speeds. Meanwhile, the aft bypass ports, positioned near the engine face, remain closed via a nose gear downlock switch to maintain proper airflow into the engine. However, at these low speeds, insufficient air flowed through the cowl inlets for adequate cooling, so suck-in doors mid-nacelle vents, positioned halfway along the nacelle, opened to draw in additional cooling air. And these doors would close at Mach 0.5 just after takeoff and wouldn't reopen until just before landing. Here was where the magic began. Above 30,000 feet and Mach 1.6, the inlet system transformed the J-58 from a simple turbojet into something unprecedented, a turbo ramjet. At this speed, external shock waves would start forming at the spike's tip, and inside the inlet, a critical shock wave was formed called the normal shock wave. The inside of the inlet was designed in such a way to precisely position and act upon the incoming supersonic air so that it traded its velocity for increased pressure, density and temperature, thereby converting low pressure high speed flow into the high pressure subsonic flow the compressor could handle. At this point the inlet was said to be in a started condition, and it was important that the normal shock wave was kept in its optimal position near the throat for maximum efficiency. The issue that engineers had to overcome was to keep that normal shock wave in that optimal position within the diffuser as the aircraft gathered speed, and the only way to do that would be to change the shape of the intake by altering the position of the inlet spike. And it was now that a computer took over, unlocking the spikes from their forward position. Initially, the spike positioning was controlled by the air inlet computer, an analog system, but its limited precision led to many problems, and it was replaced by the Digital Automatic Flight and Inlet Control System, or DAFIX. But for our purposes, we'll just stick with the DAFIX. The DAFIX would begin retracting each spike approximately 1.6 inches for every 0.1 Mach increase, simultaneously modulating the forward bypass ports above Mach 1.4 to maintain the optimal duct pressure ratio. At the Blackbird's cruising speed of Mach 3.2, the spike had retracted to its full 26 inches, effectively doubling the inlet area from 8.7 to 18.5 square feet, while the throat narrowed to just 4.1 square feet, 54% of its area from Mach 1.6. This dramatic geometry change compressed incoming air at an impressive 40-to-1 ratio, with each inlet swallowing roughly 100,000 cubic feet of air every second. With the spike fully retracted aft, the external shock wave was now precisely positioned at the cowl lip, the inlet's leading edge, for maximum efficiency. This positioning was critical. The system worked by essentially cramming supersonic air back into subsonic speeds, like forcing a high-pressure water jet back into a garden hose. However, at Mach 3.2, the J-58's inlet was capturing more air than the compressor could handle. So, instead of dumping the excess overboard, engineers asked, why not use it first to cool the engine and then, as a bonus, to turn it into extra thrust? Here, cowl air bleeds around the inside of the nacelle solved the problem by capturing nearly 50% of the incoming air, slowing it to subsonic speeds through shock traps and routing it around the engine for cooling. Now, rather than wasting this bypass air, the system fed it into the afterburner ejector, where the high-speed exhaust pulled it through the nacelle, further increasing thrust. At high Mach speeds, the ram air effect on the aircraft's velocity already compresses and heats the air. This actually reduced the compressor's effectiveness and risked dangerous compressor stalls as blade speeds approached their limits. There was also a mechanical problem. The faster the air entered the compressor, the faster the compressor blades had to spin to avoid stalling. Higher rotational speeds, however, increased stress on the discs, risking metal fatigue. During tests, compressor discs could become so hot as to be soft enough to be bendable by hand. A ramjet avoids all of these issues by eliminating the compressor entirely. However, ramjets, as mentioned earlier, cannot operate at low speeds, which is why early Lockheed Gusto designs experimented with hybrid turbojet ramjet arrangements. The solution to preventing compressor stall or failure was elegant. Engineers installed 24 bleed air doors around the fourth stage of the compressor. At around Mach 2, the bleed air doors would be opened and the air, which was now at around 1000 degrees Fahrenheit and 200 psi, would make its way down one of the 6 tubes here shown in the video and carried around the engine core, then reinserted back into the engine just aft of the turbine but before the afterburner, completely bypassing the engine core. This system, known as the Recover Bleed Air or Bleed Bypass engine, was developed by Dr. Bob Abernethy, one of the greatest technical minds of the 20th century, who apparently fought for 7 months to convince skeptical bosses of his ideas to increase engine thrust. In effect, with the bleed bypass, the engine can now operate safely at extreme temperatures and avoid compressor stalls, making continuous Mark III cruise possible, with the engines typically near the minimum afterburner setting, burning roughly 20,000 pounds of fuel per hour per engine. By the way, I have also included a link in the description to a video of a fantastic talk by Dr. Bob Abernethy, which is definitely worth a listen. It's at this point that we begin to see the system's brilliance. The inlet alone provided 54% of the aircraft's thrust. The ejector nozzle contributed 29%, but the actual turbojet core produced merely 17%. As Kelly Johnson famously quipped, by Mark III, the J-58 engine was simply along for the ride. This incredible efficiency was possible partly because of the thin air at 80,000 feet. With less atmospheric pressure, the engine didn't need to build up as much internal pressure to produce a fast exhaust jet. The Blackbird was actually known to achieve better fuel mileage the faster it flew, a counterintuitive characteristic that defied conventional aviation wisdom. And unlike most military aircraft, where the afterburner is a temporary tool used for takeoff, combat maneuvers, or short bursts of speed, because of the heat and fuel demands are too extreme for continuous use, the Blackbird family with their J-58 engines could run in afterburner continuously, something unheard of in jet propulsion. From the moment these aircraft began their climb into the thin stratosphere, the throttles were pushed past the military power detent into afterburner, and that's where they stayed for most of the flight. However, there was one problem with the engine and nacelle design that almost grounded the whole program. You see, the purpose of the inlet cone was to keep the shockwave position at the lip of the nacelle intake. If there were a pressure buildup inside the mouth of the engine, it would push the shockwave out of alignment, and when that happened, the sudden expulsion of the shockwave from the inlet would cause the infamous unstart, a phenomenon characterized by a deafening bang, a violent shudder, and the aircraft lurching sideways as if it had been hit by a train. Thrust would also drop by as much as 70%, and the aircraft would yaw and roll violently towards a failed inlet. Pilots described their helmets smashing against the canopy, necks being whipped violently, and sometimes even dazed from the impact. One test pilot remembered a series of unstarts that rattled his head like a jackhammer. Another pilot, Don Malik, said that it could snap your helmet sideways into the glass. And these events weren't even rare. They were always raised to pounce, especially during climbs through Mach 2.5 and 2.9, and at least one early A-12 was lost this way, overwhelmed by an unstart-related spin. Lockheed engineers like Ben Rich fought desperately to solve the problem, and to keep the jet controllable, the air inlet control system added 2 ingenious tricks: auto restart and cross tie. If one inlet unstarted, the computer would dump the shockwave, reposition a spike, and try again automatically. Above Mach 2.3, the system would even deliberately shut down the other inlet, forcing both sides to restart simultaneously, thereby maintaining aircraft balance. But the drag was enormous, but hey, it was better than flipping upside down at 3 times the speed of sound. In the early days, pilots had to manage the spikes manually, following detailed schedules while juggling dozens of other instruments and tasks, and mistakes were unforgiving. But later, even when automation improved, Kelly Johnson insisted that pilots still train for manual recovery. Practice blowouts were even reintroduced in the SR-71 syllabus to prevent crews from becoming complacent. CIA pilot Frank Murray experienced an unstart over North Vietnam that forced him to shut down an engine and limp home for an hour on the other, running at maximum temperature the whole way. By the late 1970s, digital upgrades, specifically the DAFIX computer, finally gave the system near-perfect reliability. The dreaded unstart, once the defining terror of flying a Blackbird, became a rarity. But every pilot who strapped into an A-12 or SR-71 carried a memory of the bang, the lurch, the sudden violence of an unstart, and, without a doubt, the auto restart system saved countless lives. The A-12 wasn't just built to fly fast and high, it was built to fly without being seen and, of course, not be intercepted while collecting intelligence. But without the cameras and electronics, the whole program would have been completely pointless. As one photographic interpreter put it, without an outstanding camera package, the A-12 and the SR-71 would just be burning very expensive holes in the sky. But before they could take pictures, they had to know how to get there. The A-12's internal navigation system, or INS, was a completely self-contained unit and was able to provide navigation without any electromagnetic radiation or reliance on external radio beacons, meaning that it wouldn't emit any signals that could potentially give away its presence. The system provided for everything the pilot would need, such as attitude, true heading, ground speed, distance, and geographic position data that he could use for either automatic or manual navigation between waypoints. The pilot could update position information to correct gyro drift by taking fixes with a view scope or by taking sun or star fixes with an optical device which was said to be so sensitive that it would lock onto bolts and screws of hangar ceilings. The large view scope was located in the center of the front instrument panel, and with it, pilots got a wide angle field of view of the ground below. The scope could also display a route film strip that gave the pilot a visual reference of their progress or further information like letdown plates for landing. 3 companies developed cameras for the Oxcart program: Perkin-Elmer, Eastman Kodak, and Hikon. Each firm took a different approach, but only the Perkin-Elmer Type 1 camera was used during operational missions. The Type 1 was an enormous stereo camera with an 18-inch lens and loaded with 5,000 feet of film with a concentric supply and take-up system to make sure that the film weight remained centralized, minimizing potential changes in the aircraft's center of gravity as the film advanced. The unique camera system utilized 2 reflecting cube scanners positioned one behind the other. This provided imagery to be scanned simultaneously onto either the left or right film spool. This setup gave 42 degrees of stereo coverage directly below the aircraft and a total swath of 134 degrees wide, which from 80,000 feet translated to 72 miles on the ground. Amazingly, from that height, the camera could resolve details down to about 1 foot on the ground, enough to capture whole regions in a single pass. Compared to the SR-71's cameras, the A-12s had better resolution and much wider coverage, but the system simply wouldn't fit into the SR-71's bays. The Perkin-Elmer unit proved so reliable it only ever failed once on a mission. One of the biggest challenges of producing clear images was the heat. At Mach 3, the A-12 skin would, as we know, get extremely hot, yet the camera bay inside had to stay cool. That meant the giant 2-foot square camera window had to survive enormous temperature differences without warping or ruining the pictures. In flight, the aircraft could swing from -40 to nearly 300 on the skin where the camera lens would be located, and to protect the film from this heat, engineers designed a special barrier window that kept the temperature steady around the camera. A vacuum pump sealed the space between the camera and the glass, insulating it like a giant thermos bottle. The massive Type 1 camera itself peered out through an extraordinary piece of glass, a quartz window measuring 22 by 23 inches, that was developed by Corning Glassworks, who spent 3 years and over $2 million perfecting it. They even fused the quartz into its frame using high-frequency sound waves, a process no one had ever tried before. One of the A-12's most unusual features was a system called Birdwatcher. This acted like a remote health monitor, sending coded signals back to a ground station so engineers could track the aircraft's condition even when it was thousands of miles away. Here's how it worked. The system continuously and constantly listened to dozens of sensors across the aircraft, such as the condition of the engines, fuel flow, altitude, speed, and more. If anything strayed outside of the predetermined limits, Birdwatcher automatically chirped 3 quick bursts of sound over a special radio channel. Each chirp carried a coded update about the aircraft's status. Pilots even heard the chirps in their headsets, which is how the system got its name. The pilot could also trigger Birdwatcher manually via one or two buttons marked A and B. These let him signal basic mission updates. A usually meant everything was on track, say after a successful refueling, while B indicated a problem. Used in sequence, they could tell ground controllers and engineers exactly how serious the situation was. What made Birdwatcher unusual was that it couldn't be silenced. The A-12's other radios could be muted before entering hostile airspace, but Birdwatcher kept chirping if it detected trouble, whether the pilot liked it or not. Ground stations could even ping the system to request a status update, which sometimes frustrated pilots, especially when it happened to be while they were over enemy territory. On the ground, technicians in a secure room at Area 51 or Kadena Air Base monitored the stream of chirps on paper readouts, and if a problem cropped up, lights on a large board in the command post would light up, alerting officers instantly to the aircraft's condition. The A-12's survival depended not just on its speed and altitude, but also on its electronic countermeasures suite, a collection of systems designed to confuse and hopefully defeat enemy missiles. Before entering hostile territory, pilots ran a built-in test using a single switch. If the test passed, Birdwatcher system would chirp, signaling to the ground control that the aircraft was ready to penetrate enemy airspace, and if it failed, the mission was scrubbed. The pilots were said to live by the motto, "In God and ECM we trust." The pilot's interface was simple. There were 5 lights above the instrument panel that told him everything he needed to know. There were 2 DF or direction finding lights that warned him when enemy radar was tracking the aircraft. One light showed the general direction, whereas if both DF lights were on, it meant trouble was coming from multiple sides. The inner LI or launch indicator lights were the critical warning. They meant that missiles were in the air and on the way. Then came the moment of truth. If the ECM was working as it should, a jam green light would illuminate, showing the system was actively jamming the missile's guidance. But if a jam red light lit up instead, the pilot had to grab the jam override button on the control stick and hold it down to activate emergency noise jamming. Pilot Frank Murray recalls the unusual sequence of events. When a SAM sight was on you, the DF light or lights would come on and this started the Birdwatcher chirping. Then the LI light or lights would come on, indicating a missile launch. Then came the moment of truth. Sometime into the missile flight time, the active parts of the ECM suite would activate and a jam green light would illuminate. This indicated to the pilot that the ECM system was working to counter the missile's guidance system. If, however, the jam red light illuminated, this indicated that the active elements of the system weren't working correctly, in which case the pilot then had to depress and hold down a button marked Jam Override, located on the top right portion of the flight control stick. This activated the noise jammer part of the ECM suite. I have to say though, that I'm not aware of anyone in the program having to use the Joe button. Remarkably, no A-12 pilot ever had to use that panic button. The ECM suite had several components with fantastically cryptic code names. Each of these deserves, in my opinion, their own episode. For example, they had PinPeg, which was the radar warning receiver, and this system constantly scanned for the distinctive signatures of SA-2 missile radars, and when it detected a threat, it would automatically activate the jammers. Then there was the Blue Dog 2. Now this was the heavy hitter. It was a 480-pound system that used something called range gate pull-off to fool incoming missiles. This essentially fed false information to the missile's guidance system, making it think that the aircraft was somewhere else. Then there was Big Blast and Mad Moth. These provided additional protection through different jamming techniques. For instance, Big Blast used noise and deception, while Mad Moth specialized in angle deception to throw off missile targeting. Gotta love those names. All the equipment worked together. For instance, the navigation systems got the aircraft to the target, the cameras captured the intelligence, the ECM systems kept everything alive long enough to get home, and the monitoring systems ensured that ground control always knew the aircraft's status. The result was an aircraft that could penetrate the most heavily defended airspaces in the world, gather multiple types of intelligence simultaneously, return with actionable information within 24 hours, all while travelling at 3 times the speed of sound at 80,000 feet. Having a fast aircraft and fancy cameras are all very well and good, but they couldn't do the job alone. Someone had to fly the machine, and at 80,000 feet, or maybe 90,000 feet, that somebody would be entering an environment as lethal as outer space. And before the program could even think about missions, Lockheed had to solve a more basic problem: how to keep a man alive inside a cockpit that would get hotter than an oven, fly higher than Everest, and pressurized against an atmosphere that was almost a vacuum. The solution was as ingenious as the aircraft itself. Lockheed turned to the David Clark Company and the Firewall Corporation to build a full pressure suit, the S-901, that would give each pilot his own self-contained world. Custom made for every Oxcart pilot and costing $30,000 apiece, these suits were less like uniforms and more like a spaceship. In truth, that's exactly what they were: sealed environments with their own oxygen, cooling and pressure control, worn because the cockpit alone could never guarantee survival. Pilots described the suit as like wearing a hot water bottle, sweating through long pre-flight preparations while technicians checked every joint for leaks. Without it, a sudden depressurization at altitude would have meant instant death. With it, the pilot had at least a fighting chance. But survival extended beyond just staying cool and breathing, and if disaster struck, the A-12's rocket-boosted ejection seat had to work at any speed and altitude the aircraft could reach. Early versions had the SR-1, a system that was so robust that test dummies successfully ejected from Mark III at 80,000 feet. But as with everything, the life support system wasn't perfect. The early suits leaked, cooling often lagged, and the bulk in the already cramped cockpit made life extremely unpleasant. But over time, the design matured, it was tested and refined in the Nevada desert, until it became reliable enough to entrust it with their lives. In fact, the S-901 suit and its supporting systems became the direct forerunners of the Apollo astronaut gear. The question was now, who would be the men chosen to wear these suits and strap into that cockpit? Would you? The Oxcart program rested on 2 foundations: the engineers who cobbled the aircraft together and the men who'd risked their lives in an aircraft that officially didn't exist. Finding pilots worthy of the A-12 was almost as difficult as building it. Selection criteria, written jointly by the CIA, Air Force and Kelly Johnson, demanded more than just flying skill: 2,000 hours of flight time, half of it in frontline fighters, age between 25 and 40, seasoned but yet adaptable, married, emotionally stable, and of course highly motivated. They also had to be under 6 feet and 175 pounds to fit into the cramped cockpit. From a painstaking review of Air Force files, 16 men were quietly pulled for evaluation. Even their commanders weren't told why they had been summoned. CIA medical and psychological screening winnowed the group, and by late 1961, only 5 accepted the offer, with no details beyond what it involved: a highly advanced aircraft and absolute secrecy. A second round of selections brought the total to 11 operational A-12 pilots. I'll put their names up on the screen. Like the U-2 drivers before them, they were sheep-dipped into CIA cover identities. 3 later left the programs and others were diverted to related projects, but all carried the same burden: to master a machine that no one outside a handful of people was allowed to know existed. Supporting these new pilots was Lockheed's own cadre of test pilots: Jim Eastman, Bob Gilliland, Darrell Greenemeyer, Bill Park, Art Peterson, Lou Show, and Bill Weaver. These men flew first, ironing out all the problems before turning the controls over to the CIA. On April 25, 1962, Lockheed's Lou Schulk took what Kelly and Lockheed had come to call the aircraft the Article, in this case Article 121, for what was supposed to be a high-speed taxi test. Instead, following the Skunk Works tradition of unscheduled test flights, he lifted off for an unannounced hop. The A-12 skimmed less than 2 miles at an altitude of barely 20 feet, where it started to experience violent lateral oscillations. In Kelly's words, it was horrible to see. Shoke, calm under pressure, set Article 121 down on a dry lake bed in a cloud of dust. Everyone thought at that moment that he had crashed. When the nose of the aircraft emerged from the dust, Kelly's angry call came over the radio. "What in the hell, Lou?" Shoke later admitted that the A-12 wasn't supposed to leave the ground, but that he had felt the urge to fly it. The issue that had caused the lateral oscillations was traced down to an improperly rigged flight control linkage, and 5 days later, on April 30th, 1962, after the problem was fixed, Shoke made the official maiden flight. Article 121 climbed smoothly to 30,000 feet and cruised just under 400 miles an hour for 59 minutes. On landing, Shoke reported the A-12 handled beautifully, and Kelly Johnson called it the smoothest official first flight of any aeroplane I've ever designed. After this, the test program advanced quickly. As the A-12 completed its test program in 1965, a critical question remained. Where would this expensive, sophisticated aircraft actually be used? The answer wouldn't come over the Soviet Union as originally planned, but in the escalating conflict of Southeast Asia, where the A-12 would finally prove its worth in combat, only to be retired just as it hit its stride. The first operational proposals came in 1964 with Project Upwind. The Office of Special Activities wanted to fly an A-12 alongside a U-2 configured for electronic intelligence gathering on an 11,000-mile mission around the Baltic Sea. This plan called for the A-12 to skirt the coasts of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland and East Germany, remaining just outside Soviet airspace while provoking radar operators into activating suspected anti-ballistic missile sites at Tallinn, Estonia. The mission would take 8 hours and 40 minutes and require 4 air refuelings. Both the CIA and Defense Department supported the proposal, but the then Secretary of State Dean Rusk opposed it, and it was never forwarded to President Johnson. Cuba presented another opportunity under Project Skylark. By early 1964, 4 A-12s were designated as primary Skylark aircraft, later joined by 2 more A-12s. The program aimed to provide contingency overflights to monitor Soviet assurances not to redeploy nuclear missiles on the island following the 1962 missile crisis. However, these plans were cancelled as it was thought they would disturb the prevailing political calm. Instead, Southeast Asia took priority. In 1967, US intelligence had reported that North Vietnam might receive surface-to-surface ballistic missiles, weapons that could strike American bases and allies across the region. To confirm whether the intelligence was indeed correct, the CIA were ready to deploy the A-12 and convinced President Johnson to approve this idea under the codename Black Shield. In May 1967, 3 A-12s flew from Area 51 to Okinawa in a series of 6-hour flights with multiple aerial refuelings. By May the 29th, the detachment was declared ready for combat operations. On May the 31st, the first operational A-12 mission took off, flying at Mach 3.2 and 80,000 feet, making a front door entry over Haiphong, photographed Hanoi and other targets, and then exited near Dien Bien Phu. The entire flight over North Vietnam took just 12 minutes but captured 70 of the 190 known SAM sites. Over 15 months, Black Shield flew 29 missions, a majority over North Vietnam, 2 over Cambodia, and 3 over North Korea during the USS Pueblo crisis. During these missions, they flew through the heaviest air defenses in the world, and although missiles were fired at them, not a single one was able to reach the A-12s. The intelligence gathered proved that there were no surface-to-surface missiles in North Vietnam, and that also that North Korea were not planning any follow-up military action after having seized the USS Pueblo. These missions enabled US military commanders to plan more effective bombing routes, which undoubtedly saved American lives. However, the A-12 single-seat design placed an enormous workload on its pilots, who had to simultaneously fly the aircraft and operate their complex reconnaissance systems. Even as Oxcart was declared operational in November 1965, moves were already underway to shut it down. Some question the necessity and cost of funding both the CIA's A-12 program and the Air Force's SR-71. It was even proposed that alongside phasing out the A-12s, that to also stop SR-71 procurement, though Defense Secretary McNamara declined this proposal since the SR-71 wasn't scheduled to become operational until September 1966. And after various budget studies were performed, it was voted that the A-12 program be terminated and assigning all remaining missions to the SR-71. President Johnson accepted this recommendation, directing that the Oxcart program be terminated by January 1, 1968. As the Vietnam War escalated and Black Shield's results became apparent, the wisdom of the phase-out decision was questioned, causing delays. On November 3, 1967, the A-12 and SR-71 were compared in a stateside fly-off codenamed Nice Girl. The outcome of Nice Girl was deemed inconclusive, though the A-12's Type 1 camera had better resolution than the SR-71's optics. However, the SR-71 could gather simultaneous coverage including photography, signals intelligence, and radar intelligence via its nose-mounted ground mapping radar. Despite continued objections from various quarters of the government, the termination decision was reaffirmed on May 16, 1968 by McNamara and endorsed by President Johnson 5 days later. So, June 1968 was set as the earliest date to begin flights from Kadena back to Lockheed's Palmdale facility for storage. But tragedy struck during preparations for the ferry flights. On June 4, 1968, Jack Weeks left Kadena in Article 129 for a functional check flight. After completing fuel loading and accelerating away was the last time anyone saw of the pilot or the aircraft. Birdwatcher transmissions indicated starboard engine over temperature above 860 degrees and low fuel flow, followed by altitude loss below 68,000 feet. The evidence suggested that engine malfunction contributed to a catastrophic failure and aircraft breakup. No wreckage was ever found, and it was particularly tragic to lose a pilot on one of the program's final flights. Jack Weeks was posthumously awarded the Intelligence Star for Valor, which was accepted by his widow. Once all the A-12s were ferried back to Palmdale, company technicians drained all the fluids and arranged the 9 surviving aircraft in a tightly packed formation in a hangar corner where they were to remain for the next 20 years. Well, if you made it this far, I can only say thank you very much. This was one of the most ambitious projects I've undertaken since starting this channel, and as you can tell by the length of this video, I may have gone a little bit overboard, but I'll give you the reason why in the next video. So I want to dedicate this video to the very first monkey who picked up a rock or a stick to solve a problem. Because from that very first moment, curiosity and ingenuity became part of our DNA. And also this dedication is for all the engineers who came after, those who shaped metal, tested ideas, built machines that carried us higher, faster and further than anyone thought possible. One day when the aliens come to Earth and they ask us to tell them the story of human progress, what will we say? Will we tell them about the kings, the generals, the politicians? Or will we tell them the truth? That the real milestones were never written by them. They were written by the engineers, the mechanics, the fixers, the inventors, the dreamers and the doers. The people who looked at a problem and refused to accept that it couldn't be solved, where the word impossible is a call to action. If you think about it, it took nearly 2.6 million years to go from that first monkey picking up a rock to human beings flying a Mark III. 2.6 million years. Almost all of that time was spent inching forward slowly, figuring out fire, tools, wheels, and then the written language, which we discovered only about 5,000 years ago. But once the spark really took hold, the pace was explosive. The Wright brothers lifted off a Kitty Hawk in 1903, and in just 60 years, barely a single lifetime, we went from that fragile wooden fabric flyer to an aircraft that cruised at 80,000 feet at 3 times the speed of sound. That's why engineers matter. They are the bridge between imagination and reality. the reason why impossible eventually becomes routine, and yes, the reason why you can watch this video right now, and hey, why not subscribe? And finally, I want to dedicate this video to my son Adam, who I hope will follow in the footsteps of great engineers like Hooker, Whittle, Watt, Kelly Johnson, Brunel, Goddard, Petter, Chadwick, and Stevenson as he begins his degree in mechanical engineering.